to kick it off, we are here with our very own town resident, Brian Geffert, who is the Global Chief Information Security Officer at KPMG International. So we are very, very privileged to have his expertise to basically help us parents navigate the scary world of the internet, especially when our kids are involved. So I think that given that we have a relatively small group here, and as people join in, we'll monitor this, but this is going to be a fairly informal presentation. Brian's going to walk us through it. It can be a discussion. If you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type your question into the chat box, and I'll make sure that we do pause to address it. And then just so everyone's aware, we are recording this session. We will subsequently post it on the town's YouTube channel, as well as send a link to that recording back out to everyone who has RSVP'd. So with that said, Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent, Quinn, thank you. And first of all, I'd like to thank everyone as well for joining today. You know, it's in the world, as part of my role, I work around cybersecurity and the protection and what we do for my company, but it's really working with our clients and everyone else around that. So, you know, you joining today is really important for me, particularly as a security officer, because, you know, what we're trying to do is constantly help thwart what's happening with these threat actors out there and what they do to take advantage of what's going on. So I really want to thank you today, because you're going to make my job a lot easier in terms of not falling for what these certain preys are for the tactics and the things that they're doing. And what I'd just like to say too is, as Quinn said, you know, we have a very small group, so please make it interactive as possible as you want. Ask me questions along the way, and we can definitely talk about that. So what I'm going to do is to start talking, and we sometimes do this as a show of hands and things like that, but I wanted to ask a couple of these questions up front. It's always good, is sort of this first amount: what's the proportion of web activity involved in social media platforms? And what does everybody think what that might be, right? And how much we see going on in the world? So is it around 40%, 50%, 80%? What is does anybody have a guess? We've got one, so 80%, there you go. All right, so we'll go through it quickly, and you're spot on. It's 80% of the activity is really what's the proportion on social media platforms out there. So when we're looking at what people are doing and getting involved and coming at web activity, it's on things like Facebook, it's on Twitter, it's on you know, in Instagram, or today as the kids are doing at Snapchat, these types of way of exchanging. So it's a lot of that activity that's happening. So these platforms become things that you know, can be exposed by, you know, what I consider you know, threat actors. And so the other part that we looked at, as we were sort of doing some research with my company, so what proportion of teenagers don't have their Facebook account set to private? And what does that mean? It's what, you know, anyone can see their personal information, their photos, and those types of things. And so do we think it's about 5%, 7%, 17%? So we got people coming in 5%. So what we really find out right now about this one is it's about 17%. And you know, that's one of the things that, you know, we always want people to be thinking about. You know, in my world, what we always want to do when people do something called footprinting, they investigate people and they try to look at their different accounts and they try to understand what they're doing. And so the more information we put out there sometimes is that we inadvertently let people know what's going on. So it's always about, what do we do to protect? How much do we really want to put out there for what threat actors are doing? And so what we want, this one's one of my favorite ones that we talk about, because part of my job is doing it. So how many websites are hacked every day? If you really want to think about this one, okay? And so you're right. So we got the one in here. So it is about 30,000 websites are hacked every day. So when you really think about that, there is a number of continuous activities that are really going on out there. So, as we look at these combinations of, about, 80% of the stuff is on platforms and social media and what they're exchanging. We see people who have it out there with sort of unprotected data. They don't really think sometimes what they post and see it. And then you look at these sites where there's a lot of hacking going on. There are some challenges and things out there, but my point of also saying some of these things isn't always about going off and saying, hey, it's the worst place you can be. There are some good things about the internet and what it does and how it's exchanged people and how they've been able to connect in good syndication ways and everything we're doing. So when I always do these talks, I just want to remind people there's been a lot of benefits from the internet. It's connected people. It's helped people, connect with others to learn more about them, to find other people in their same ways, to get information and do research on pieces. So there's a lot of positives, but what we want to do is talk about how do we do it smartly. And we really look at sort of three groups. And one, we look at more of our senior citizens that are not as technically savvy, but you'll find scammers. And we'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow. So if you have any sort of older parents that are there and you want to learn about that, that's tomorrow. But today we want to focus really on, you're part of one, but the one we focus on today are the children today. And in these age ranges, really, as I see, anywhere from like 7 to 17 that's applicable here. I struggle, when to start letting kids get on the internet unsupervised or when to start to have a phone. So we always want to be, what I always give the advice to is it depends. Everyone says, well, when should I let that happen? And it really depends on one, the maturity of the young adult or the child of what they do. And secondly, it's how involved you may be as a parent with them and doing it jointly so you can really teach things. So I think that's the question we always kind of go back and forth with. But what are we really going to talk about today? So we're going to talk about protecting online. We're going to talk about watching content online safely. We're going to look at some of the safe uses of social media. The bigger topic that I really want to make sure we advocate about is around cyberbullying. This is always a challenge that goes along. And my biggest issue, there's a book called The Cyber Effect, and it's written by a psychologist, a cyber psychologist. Her name is Mary Atkins, and she's out of Ireland. And if you've ever seen the show CIS Cyber, is part of this crime show, that show is patterned after the work that she does. And one of the things that she writes about in the book, in The Cyber Effect, is that how people change their personas when they're online versus when they're in person. And they do things differently. Sometimes they become more aggressive online than they would be face-to-face. And sometimes there's attacks. And so these are the things that, again, are all things we'll talk about a little bit today. We want to talk about smartphones and how to use phones smartly. Online gaming is also a big thing to be thinking about. It's a connectivity with people. We'll give a little advice about some cyber attacks out there. If you're watching the news, it's there. And then finally, a little bit about some screen time advice. I hate to break it, but I think some of that screen time advice goes for me too. I'm on way too many screens all the time, but we'll kind of talk about those different areas. So, but again, please, as we're going through today, what we want you to do is to learn about the cyber safety. Please ask questions if they come up. And then, if you have some responses, we'll do some text chats, all those things, great. I want to make it interactive as we can. So let's talk about the first area, and what it means around is really protecting, your children's identities online. Identity theft and your credentials being stolen happens all the time. You see this if you've ever put anything out, whether it was Equifax and all that. There's ways that your information is bought and sold and put on the internet, but we always want to make sure with our younger generation that they do be protective of it. So, what are some of the things that you should be thinking about? First thing we always want to talk about here is to choose your usernames wisely. So we try not to use, so my name's Brian Geffert. So when we kind of talk about usernames, we try not, I would not recommend for kids using Brian Geffert as their name. So think of a name that's something that doesn't identify with them. Those are things so that people can track and look at. And also is talking about using, practice password safety. Don't share your password. Don't allow other people to have it. Don't do those different things. I think that's really important. But also too, it's about how you put passwords together, make sure they're strong, multi-character, try to change them up as much as you can as well. What we should always do is the kids should check with you also before signing up to something. There's so many things you can sign up with on the internet. Some legitimate, some so not legitimate, some do credential harvesting. So it's always important to realize what they're signing up for and why. Particularly too, if there's age content restrictions that you want to be looking at. So, there's a number of things. It's always good to have a dialogue with them about this. We should also too, you want to enable the security settings or even download some security tools and software. The good thing about having a father who's the chief information security officer is you get a lot of tools and protection. The bad news, I think, for my son is he got a lot of surveillance on his phone and his computer. And that, so there are things that you can really do. There are tools where you can actually monitor some of their habits and things they're doing. Again, I use that wisely, but there's also things about making sure antivirus is up to date, making sure that, that you're putting potentially VPN and those types of things, but we'll talk about later. So I think it's an important thing to be thinking about there. Okay, so I think that's one of the things, and I have to go back and I'll make a recommendation on one tool that I do like. There's someone's out there. I'll put some chats where, when you look at monitoring, but in terms of being able to help monitor sites that your children are on and doing. But I always recommend antivirus. My big one around that particularly is Symantec, McAfee. Antivirus on any of our end devices are really important. So you can do that. That's one thing that really helps out a lot. The thing that's important here that I definitely want to be bringing up is around keeping software and programs up to date. You'll see this from Apple a lot. You can actually turn on the updates automatically. And why is that important? A lot of times they're finding 0-day vulnerabilities, and it's harder to attack those when the software is up to date and people are doing things. So, it's very easily check for those software updates. Doing that regularly is a pretty important idea. This one's probably more critical, is think before you click. There's a thing we talk about, you'll hear is clickbait. We'll talk about probably a little bit later, but it's always, you want to click on that link. Anytime you click on a live link, it connects you to something, and those links can be good links, but they can be malicious links. It just depends on where you're at and what you're looking at. If you talked earlier about kids signing up for something, if it's a bad harvesting site, they'll click on it, they'll collect credentials. So I always talk about think twice, click once when you do something. And a good issue here is never share post email addresses. Especially, and again, we're talking about things with kids. We really want to make sure that when you post those online, it's just an avenue for threat actors or people to talk with them and do that. So you want to try to limit that as much as possible. And please, on this one too, do not reply on spam messages. The time all those are doing out there is they generate more and more things to collect and harvest data, and they get you on. And I think the big issue, it should be just spam email, but the amount of spam text coming out these days is really over the top. So you also want to make sure you're looking at texting these days. There's a lot of links that says, hey, it's your birthday, or hey, we just got something, or the one I saw recently is, you won a prize from AT&T, right? And all these types of things. And those are ones where they want you to click on the link. And it can either do things where you download, malware, or you actually open up other areas. Yes?
Brian, if I may interrupt you with a question. With regards to the texts, oftentimes it'll say, type 0 if you don't want to receive any of these messages anymore. And then the email equivalent is like, hit the unsubscribe link. Do you recommend us doing that, or just ignore it completely?
So a lot of times, that when they're more legitimate, you'll get that response on a text that says hit 0 if you don't want to reply or type. Those are more legitimate ones that you're working with. Okay, so that's typically an indicator for me. On the ones that aren't, that are really spam and coming after, they don't really want to give you that option. They want you to respond and they want you to click on it. Okay, so typically when someone's giving you that, it's 99 times out of 100, it's okay. The one area I would think about too is when you're looking at some of the spam email, just always be cautious about them a little bit. A lot of times too, it's okay to unsubscribe. There is a law in the United States, particularly called the Can-Spam Act, where they have to do that. I typically will do two things now. One, I'll either just push it straight to junk and make sure that it's tagged that way. Or, if I kind of look at it, and we'll look at ways to see if something looks legitimate, that you just got a marketing email because you signed up for something. It's those types of judgment calls on those, right? More legitimate ones. So, I guess my always thing is it depends just a little bit. But I do think, particularly with younger folks, I would recommend not replying, just teaching them not to do that at all, not to hit unsubscribe. You don't want to get more of a footprint out there about who you are and sort of what you do. So good question on that. That's a tough one because you get a lot of that where you can opt out. The next part about, again, sharing personal information with strangers. There's one of the tougher things is around being able to say who is on the other side of it. You don't really know sometimes. And part of that is where you always want to make sure if you're going to share anything, you know who you're sharing it with, why, or you have contact. So please, it's no different that you don't talk to, like I grew up in a very small town. I make this joke if you're talking to my wife, I grew up where the elevation was higher than the population. We really kind of knew everybody. And, you said, don't talk to strangers. The same things apply, what you learned there apply online. Don't share with strangers. You don't talk with strangers. If it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true. And so those are also everything that we've learned growing up in the real world applies in the virtual world. And I think that's a very important part. Sometimes people forget, they think it's different in the virtual world. It's not. The same people, the same threat actors do those things. One of the things I do try to caution here too is avoiding free Wi-Fi. And you'll say, well, Brian, I'm in Starbucks. Can I do that? Starbucks isn't so bad. You kind of looked at that, but what I would be cautious about is you picking Wi-Fi up anywhere and doing it. That's usually spots are not there. Airport Wi-Fi is also sometimes, can be sketchy on what you're doing. And that's the issue there. When it's free Wi-Fi, it usually means that they haven't used the right certificates. The security isn't as good and you're likely there. So, I do caution every once in a while, but, if you're in, like I said, Starbucks or other places like that, it's not so bad, but always try to limit what you're doing there. I would not start using credit cards and doing all that. Checking your email and maybe chatting with a friend is not a bad idea, but don't go buying things and other things like that. And then I think the last thing that we always try to talk about with identities is logging out. Don't stay logged in. The best thing you can really do is do that. And also locking your equipment, either have it on a timed log out where it does and you have to put a passcode to back in, or just basically making sure that you've locked out of your phone, your iPad, your laptop. A lot of kids today use their laptops in schools and things. It's really important to do that in that effort. So I know this is a lot of things to area, and like I said, we'll have the slides out, but these are really a couple of the good things and the messages I'll take away with it again is, choose your names wisely, be careful of the information that you really present out there. Think before you click is really important. How you share information, what happens in the real world is just the same principles you use in virtual space. And then also logging out and sort of locking your computers is pretty important from that level. Okay. Questions that talk about Apple versus PC. Can you, anything specific in terms of that or just the operating system, Joel? Just anything you want to? Oh, is Apple safer? That's a great question. You know, one of the things that Apple used to really brag about was that their operating system was more tighter, and they kept it there. And so I probably would have told you about 10 years ago, when I worked with the Mac OS and operating system, just because of the way it was shut down and closed, it was much safer. We're actually finding that the threat actors now are moving past that. So, you know, I wouldn't say one is more safer than other. It depends on your personal, you know, so if you're going to use it, it really depends on the safety precautions you put in it. And also the settings you enable are really important in how you use it. So I don't really, if I had a preference, I don't think either one is safer. It really takes the same level because the threat actors have caught up with it from that perspective. Okay. And a lot of times it comes down to personal preference. When I'm working in my Windows world, I like to do more sort of programming and I work on technology stuff. But when I want to do visuals and drawings and other things, I prefer Apple. So, you know, they do have their pace to look at it. You know, let's talk a little bit here about online content. You know, watching content online, you know, the thing that we always try to think about here is going to secure sites only. One of the things that we want to be talking about secure sites is always look up top, particularly for encryption. You'll see in that bar where the HTTP comes out, you'll see a little lock up there. You know, if you don't see that lock, you know, those really aren't secure sites, and I highly recommend getting off of them. Really what it means is that the traffic between you and that site is encrypted. So, you know, making sure you're there, making sure you log in, I think that's really important. And particularly too, if you're looking at certain content, you know, always be careful of what it is. So I know we have a YouTube channel, and I just found out today for the town or things like that. That's one thing. But if you go out and you're just pulling down videos from somewhere, you always have to be cautious about that. I think the question here is you know, don't just sign up on certain sites to see them for videos, right? Just think about what it is that the content that's on there. Do you really want that? You know, the reason I talk about this a lot is just because you continue to put more of a footprint out there in the things you're doing. So, you know, we think about Netflix, or you think about, you know, today it's HBO Max, it's Amazon, you know, those types of places. Do they have a YouTube channel and you're watching that? Just always watch and try to understand what your children are looking at in those different sites. And a lot of things that go for adults too. So I do want to stop for a moment and recognize that fact that just because we're talking about kids, the same thing goes for us and where we're doing it. The big issue here is really watching out as well for fake news. You know, a lot of times when we look at a lot of the sites out there, there's a new rating company out there for websites, and it particularly looks for things about this on fake news. And they're actually, they really put a rating out on how well you modify your content and the things you're doing. I forget the name of it, but they've really been cracking down on sort of sites, and they will actually put a warning up there saying that this has fake news. So we are starting to catch up to this in the industry, where, you know, we always lag a little bit against sometimes the threat actors, but this is one area that I think is important, where we're starting to really try to identify it in those types of ways. And I think the other thing too is sort of staying focused when you're watching sort of the content online, because sometimes we find people do different things. So don't multitask when you're doing it, because you never know where you might make mistakes and putting stuff out there. The other thing that I think is really important here is watching what people do download. Every time you download something from the internet, you've got to make sure you're driving from a trusted site, where it is and what's going on. I'm very cautious when I ever download anything. So what you just want to be thinking about when you're downloading stuff, or you're downloading content, where's it coming from? Is it a reputable site? A lot of times, pay sites are a lot easier versus free sites and the things that you're doing. So, you know, just think about what you want to allow them to download and when. The other part too is about recognizing scams. You know, again, we talk about things that are too good to be true. People want you to sign up for free videos, or, you know, I think one of the bigger issues we see is pirated movies and intellectual property. if you start downloading that, you can also get yourself into trouble. So, again, I go back to the old adage here. If it sounds good, too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. Something free, nothing's ever really free on the internet. You're always exchanging something for that, whether it's your data or any of those other things. And then lastly, what we always try to talk about is I always like to try to do this as an adult, is try to create a dialogue. I think it's also, you want to build trust, with your children, to ask you about certain things and really interact with the internet. Because again, there's some great tools and there's great things on there. And it actually can create some dialogue. So building that trust for them to come and talk to you and ask about things, I think is really important. And then, lastly, one of the things we want to talk about here is how do you start to look at a site, and what is really a site that is fake, or what is like sites where there's fake news on. And we always like to go through these type of things, and I always take a couple of minutes, and if you look at something like this, where would you focus and put your eyes on it, right? And that's my key thing. And one of the areas that we always try to look at, you'll talk about is, or maybe I'll stop there. Does anybody have some opportunities? Did they see anything here that would say, what, maybe this site isn't something that I think is a fake site, or there's fake news, or there might be fraudulent things that are on here? There you go. Excellent. It's not a safe site. There's no security on it. There's no HTTPS. It's a regular site, right? Sponsored content. Good one, right? No lockbox on the icon. Good stuff. This is exactly right. So you start looking at these type of ideas of what's going on. But let's talk about a couple of other things you want to be looking at here. So one of the things that we look at is when you start to see things in you check the URL, and a couple of you already did, and you looked at that. This, to some level, is not a really legitimate URL on the things, right? It should always end in sort of a .com or a .biz. That's one thing that should be telling you here. You also said to me, hey, this is there's not HTTPS. The major news sites not reporting this. So just because something says news out there doesn't really mean it's something, and it's really not reputable. I always go to things like, no matter where you are around the world, you look at Al Jazeera, you look at something around the BBC, you look at DW in Germany, or 24 France, CNN, right? Those types of things are there. That other things that we see is when you see headlines written in all capital letters. This is one of those types of giveaways where when you start to see things like that, that should tell you that, again, these things aren't there. The headlines include, big numbers and words, gigantic. They're all types of things that these aren't things that you would do where you communicate very well. And by the way, this is my favorite one. It's like, there's no author's names on these things, right? When when they're writing something, they always want a byline, okay, if it's legitimate, because you want to make sure you're getting credit for what you're writing, okay? So when you really look at it, you don't see an author, you've got to think about it. Or you see what else on this one, right? An odd date. If this is new news, why is it June 16, 2015? Okay, and the date that it's coming out. We see a lot of these sites get stood up, crash down, stood up, crash down. We talked about there's 30,000 sites that are hacked in a day, right? This is kind of one of those areas. What they do is they try to trap you in. Another good area that we look at here is photoshopped images, okay? They don't look exactly normal, right? And they're trying to entice you to look at something, crazy, right? So you've got a giant elephant seen driving a car. Just a lot of these things are trying to capture your attention. I think, 2 other areas or 3 other areas I think are really important too, is that you keep an eye out for the related articles not reporting the news. So you see all these types of things around to buy a car or surveys around this. Or what's important is also grammatical errors. One of our biggest giveaway on if you ever look at a phishing email, they've gotten a lot better, but the grammatical errors that you will see in that email should be a high giveaway. So if you get one with all those, you delete immediately, don't even go at it. But also what's more important here is this is the one that they talk about. It's clickbait. So what's the term clickbait? It's the 5 cutest puppies in the world. You know, you want to look at that because you think it's fun and it's cute, or how, you know, for younger adults, how to get better grades without studying. That's clickbait, right? You know, I want to do it and be there. So, you know, these are things that you really want to be careful, because what this becomes in my language, it's a watering hole attack. And what does that mean? It means that we want you to click on it. So when you click on it, in the background, we'll start downloading malware to you. Okay, because that's what happens, and we do that. And this is a very common thing to happen. So again, my whole idea here is not to sort of to make you scared of the internet or drive things, but it's just doing some of these simple things when you go on the sites to say, are they legitimate and what they're looking at. So before I jump off this, any questions on some of these areas and things that we talked about? All right. Well, with that saying, let's go on to my favorite one, is social media. You know, this is one that I think is really hard, you know, for several reasons. And we always want to talk about these safety tips. There's just, to me, social media and our younger generation, there's so many things that you can do wrong. You know, when I work with younger folks, I always try to tell them that things don't get erased from the internet. And so if you post it, it's going to stay forever. So always think twice before you post. We talked about think twice before you click. You also think twice before you post in that area. So what's important here is following the age restrictions and monitor the use of what it is. You want to be careful when kids are getting on. You know, I'm very hesitant sometimes as you continue to go out and the younger generation wants to take pictures, or they want to go on and they want to share things. They sometimes use some lack of judgment. So you just want to be careful and monitor what they're doing. And sometimes it's hard as a parent, right? Because, and speaking as one who, you know, where Snapchat was, you know, we made a bit of a concerted effort not to give our son a phone for a very long time. And I think we did take a little bit of grief for it, but I think it was the right decision in the end. Because, you know, what we find here is people getting on social media, making up stories. There's a lot of psychological development at an early age that if you don't work with your kids and do that, can really go bad in these areas. And I think one of the things we saw a lot with the pandemic is it can exacerbate depression and other things because of what people are posting and what they're saying and photoshopping in those different areas. Also using strong passwords. We see sometimes, a lot of times, these social media accounts get hacked, or worse, they kind of give their social media account to somebody else and they put a fake post on there for them. So again, you know, using a strong password, don't share it like we talked about earlier. Review the privacy settings. Facebook finally started getting around to this. Twitter's finally started getting around to that. In the early days, this wasn't there, but there are settings where you can stop certain things from coming up, only share with certain people. And the more you sit down and have those conversations, it's really important, because when you share something on wide open on the internet, you share it with everybody. And we just need to make sure people think about that. And I will continue to iterate this all the time when I'm talking. Stop and think before posting, or think twice then post. You know, these are such important things, because you know once you put it up there, you always want to be thinking about that and what you did. Are there password services that you recommend? You know, one of the things that I do recommend, and I'll actually pull it up for you guys at the moment when I think about it, I do think about password keepers. And one, because these days there's so many things. There's one that I do recommend that I've used for a long time. It's something called 1Password. And it's a one that I use because, you know, when you have like, 200 passwords these days or everything else, it's a very good tool that the developer is good at. It allows you to keep social security numbers in there, identification numbers, notes, and it allows you to sort of interact with things. So when we talk about password keepers versus writing them down, 1Password is a great tool that you can download on your iPhone. You can actually download it on your laptop. and it actually helps securely store your passwords even when you're web browsing. So that's one that I do highly recommend. Be careful where kids are clicking, right? Remind them that clicking on links are always that where. We also talked about trying to keep with friends only. This is where we don't like this idea of grooming, where people try to come up and be friendly with other people and do that. Keeping your friend circle, try not to get out there. One of the bigger issues with the internet is this term called syndication. And what that means is it allows sort of threat actors to actually work together better than they ever did before. So the good news about it on a positive side, we're allowed to connect people who may have certain illnesses together or sort of have experiences together. They're able to connect with each other and share those. But the bad side about it too is it connects people who may not have nefarious thoughts or their things that they're doing are bad actors. So that's one of the things that we always want to talk about is that syndication effect out there where it allows bad actors to get together and do things. And this happens a lot of times, when we talk about sort of child pornography or you talk about sort of that grooming perspective, make sure we're friends only. Respect other people's privacy. I think one of the things we want to be able to teach people here is just because somebody posts something doesn't mean you have to repost it or do something. If they don't want something being posted, don't do that. So it's really developing, I think, good etiquette habits up front. I think that pays in the long run. And I think this issue too of bullying, I'll constantly kind of come back on this one again. What people do sometimes when they get behind a keyboard, I think you probably have all experienced this at some level where, someone writes an email and they just go off, right? And they would never do that in a face-to-face discussion, but they feel sometimes when you're behind a keyboard, there's a different sense of what you can do and these different personas come out. So it happens with kids too. So, try to teach them about, be careful what you say what you mean, but, say it politely. Those are also things so you don't be that bully. And then finally, you'll keep seeing this theme, keep private information private. People don't need to know certain things. Your friends only and other people, but you don't need to keep it on the internet. Okay. And, one of the things we're going to talk about here and going into this is we're going to talk about this idea of internet trolls. And I like to read this a little bit, right? Trolls are really people who say crazy and mean things on the internet to get people mad, right? So their whole thing to be is provocative, and it's whether you're right or wrong is irrelevant. It's really to create conflict in doing that. And I think it's important so that people start to really think about that. So, we want to talk a little bit about sort of what do you do if they encounter a troll? A couple key things really important here. Number one, don't respond. It takes two people to escalate and engage, okay? And you don't have to do that. Block accounts. So, one of the things I always do when we were talking earlier about getting these spam texts, I actually block all of those callers on my phone. I continue to block them. When I do that, I have an app from AT&T that I actually report them as spam callers in doing that. Don't post that you're being trolled, right? Again, the more oxygen you give to a story, the more it goes. Do screenshot if they need to work with you, some of the interactions, right? So that they can share that with you, or if you need to be able to take it to authorities or some level. So it's easy to do on an iPhone these days. And then also there's ways to report this to the social media platform you're on, or if it comes to that level, there's ways to report this to the police in your local work, and they'll work with other agencies to help that. You always want to think about that. But particularly too, if you get into an account where there's a troll going on like this, change your account settings. Either make them private, or if you even have to change the account to a new account, make sure you're resetting passwords, all those types of things. But also encourage them to tell a trusted adult. The worst thing you can do here is be bullied and harassed and doing it in private. It's to be able to share that's really important, and I think it's something that kids need to be able to do to go with that. Because one of the issues that happens in this is this idea of online grooming, And really, this is a practice of where people try to get friendly with you. They try to do certain things where they build these relationships of trust and these sort of secret relationships. And really the intention here is to take advantage of a child or potentially cause harm. And so this idea of grooming, I talked earlier about this idea of syndication. What does it happen? So what should we really do when kids encounter that online? So the first thing we want to make sure we're really clear about: never accept the request to meet a stranger in person. Okay. And it's really important that, never say, hey, let's go meet sometime in Georgetown, or let's go do something. We don't want to do that. Try to encourage them to report this kind of suspicious behavior to a trusted adult. This is, again, you'll keep hearing a couple of themes in my talk. Building that trust relationship, with your children and getting them to talk about it. Work to block further contact, right? You can block them on the phone, you can block them on text, calling, potentially whatever platform you're on, block them through. Only engage with people they actually know and trust in real life. So things like that. If there's a niece or a nephew or a cousin or somebody that and help, do that, right? Try to make sure that they're not just getting strangers. Normally strangers don't connect with you on the internet, just like they won't walk up to you, in the middle of the Capitol in Washington and start talking to you for a reason, right? Again, as I talk about, the same things we learn in public and the real world apply here in cyberspace and in the virtual world. I think one thing that we don't give a lot of credit to kids: trust your instincts. If it feels odd or strange, then it probably is. Kids have a very good perception of things. They have a sixth sense about people sometimes, and you really want them to trust their instincts on this. If it's not right, it's not right. Walk away. And again, go back and continue after an event like this. Look at these security settings because you want to make sure that you're able to block them. Reset password accounts, change accounts if you need to. It's really important to distance those different areas from the, again, because of this grooming, you want to break that cycle. Okay. The thing we're going to talk about here, again, my other topic is around cyberbullying. What is it? It's really when people threaten, insult, spread gossip, social media, email, text. All these things are really hard. And I'm a big advocate that it's one thing to be schoolyard bullied, but I really feel that it's worse to be cyberbullied, because you can't see it really happen. When you see that bullying happen on the schoolyard or in the thing, it's actual, there's physical presence and people are around. The cyberbullying, isn't always seen in public, and it's very damaging with kids today too, because they've been very distanced from their peers and from their friends, and there's been a lot of the challenges have been disappointments. This is just one more thing right now that sort of piles on with them. We just want to make sure you're addressing this in some level, or at least watching for it, right? And we want to make sure a couple of things here is, one, with cyberbullying, the same thing we talked about with the groomers, or we talked about with trolls. Don't engage. It always takes two people to fight. And if you don't get involved with it, then even infernos burn out, right? And you just got to try to ignore it. And that's sometimes harder said than done, but it's really important. Block the bully from what they do, right? Don't have them on your social media. Don't have them on your friends list. Block them on your phone. It's really important to be able to do that. Work with sometimes the kids to get them, again, this idea of having a trusted adult is really important. It's getting counsel to make the right decisions, but also realizing it's not your fault. There's things that you've always got to be able to work through, and not take the shame in it, and really talk about it. And lastly, again, privacy is a prevention. Trying not to share information as much. Going out there is also helpful. So, when we really talk about this, part of this is really important, is to disengage with everything from the trolls to the bullies and the groomers. It does help a lot. Okay. So, what should your child do when somebody's being there? Also, I think this is where I think, I've seen this happen where, you can support friends. You know, if you're seeing, you know, and encourage your children that when they see something, say something, you know, provide support to a friend or a fellow colleague or student, be supportive. The other thing is be report it. You know, talk about it. If it's being done, let authorities know, have somebody be that, but also be an upstander. You know, stand up for somebody. You know, the worst thing we can do is watch an injustice happen sometimes. So, you know, within judgment, teach people to stand up and say, hey, it's not right. You can call it out. And that's something as an adult, it's important to talk to you about how to do that safely in your own world. But most importantly, don't participate. Sometimes you can get in groupthink and getting the, you know, the moment where it seemed harmless, but, you know, you actually become a bully because you're participating in it. So, you know, try not to do that. And these are conversations that just have to happen sometimes because, you know, even as adults, sometimes we get sucked up in the moment and the things we do. And, you know, it's just important to not participate. And that way you can start to cut it out. One of the things that we talk about too is, you know, how can you really help, right? And I think some of the things here is communicate. You know, it's really important too to report offensive or hurtful comments immediately, right? You know, whether you're the target or not, talking about it and saying something means people can do something about it. But also too, be careful, teach people to be careful what they say, send, or post. As I was just talking about, sometimes things can be perceived differently. You know, and I probably shouldn't use this example, but, you know, you know, with my son, we were having a conversation about texting over the weekend, and I have this habit of after writing something, I'll put period, 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 dot, dot, dot. And what I had not realized is that was very sort of offensive to him because he didn't really realize what I was trying to say. And so in effort, you know, it was making him comfortable, and I actually do that. So now I'm actually very conscious of after writing dot, 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 but you know, it wasn't meant to be that way, but it was just, it was a communication style. So sometimes you always just want to be careful and think about that. You know, even when you write an email, you're writing it with a tone, okay, but is the other person reading it with that same tone? And that's something that I do find is always important. How do we recognize these things from happening when people are getting sort of bullied? One, you know, what we start to see is things around unexpected anger, depression. People are getting frustrated, particularly after they're using the device. You know, you see them come out of it, and that's just one sign. You start to see them getting uneasy about going to school or participating in activities with groups. It's another key indicator that something's happening, something's wrong. Or, you know, what you start to see is this abnormal withdrawing. You know, it's not always that normal teenager thing where sometimes they'll want to just be alone and be in their room and watch YouTube. It's really just withdrawing a lot in general. Like they're not even coming out in certain circumstances when you guys have done things habitually together. So just think about those. These are signs that we start to see when kids are getting bullied around. And again, part of it we try to do is continue to take action. Save bullying texts and post these emails, right? Because, you know, we want to make sure that you're using that as evidence and things, and it's really important. Not replying, not sharing, don't insert yourself in all those types of things, or even with your children. You don't want to be getting in the middle of that. But also, you know, the good news about what we're doing here in the platforms, and I'll give them some credit, although there's things that they probably didn't very well, but they are finding ways to block and have ways to report bad behaviors. And it's really important to do that. But also too, escalating the issue to your child's school if it's happening, or the police is necessary. You know, sometimes you have to take those steps. So, you know, as you kind of walk through these things and you escalate, you know, also just think about that. You know, I think schools are taking this very seriously. You know, I know the authorities do too, because it's becoming a sort of a big issue on that. So these were a couple of heavy topics. I'm going to pause for a moment to see if there's anything that we're going to. So the couple of things we're going to end up with is around using your phone and gaming and sort of apps. But when I usually come through this, I always want to stop for a moment, because when we start talking about bullying and online grooming and all that, we typically see that. Okay. All right, well then, why don't we'll move on to our next area here. Using phones smartly. Couple things, again, passcodes are really important on that. There is, Joel, we'll come into, we'll talk about some online gaming in a second. So I'm glad you brought that up. You know, there's certain things in online gaming that we feel, because when you really start to see chat or players connecting, you know, and you do these multiplayer things, there's some things to be thinking about, and we'll hit into that topic in a minute or so. We're going to talk about here, again, I'm always going to talk about the password, strong passwords, you know, try not to use common words when you're doing your password. So why? Because they can be cracked easily, but try to think about ways you can remind those. Make sure that, you know, one of the things I used to do with our son growing up was, you know, on my iPhone, he wouldn't be able to download something unless he asked for permission, and you can set that up as a parent in their phone, particularly an iPhone. So, you know, if he wanted to download something, he'd have to click on it. It would send a notification to me. I would look at it and I would approve. You know, particularly with younger kids, I think this is really important. Only respond to phone numbers you really know, or numbers and texting, right? You know, try to, you know, help them with their contacts and thinking about that. And also, you know, here, to be careful what you communicate. One of the big issues I've always seen is people taking pictures of themselves, you know, and doing that and posting in activities. It's just try to think very clearly about, you know, what you're doing in that kind of piece. So I always think about that. You know, and one of the things there, ask before you take and share, you know, working with other people's phones and doing that too, you know, people to have it, always think about that, or allowing other people to share your phone with them, just because you don't know what they're going to write and do some stuff. Be mindful always what you're doing on your phone. You know, you're typing in things or clicking on stuff and doing it, you know, it opens you up to those different things and getting lost into it. But the big issue here that I want to caution everybody a little bit on is Bluetooth. You know, it's a great tool when you're working through your pieces, but you should always work to turn it off when you're roaming around and going in different places, because the ability, like when I was using Bluetooth about 10, 15 years ago, it was so hard to get it to connect and stay connected. But the way it is now, it is searching and it's strength and it's beaconing. I have a tool that I use in our security world where I search for Bluetooth devices within a radius, and you'd be surprised how many things I can pick up. So it's always important to turn that off if you're not using it, particularly when you're in public areas, because they can easily tap into it. But keep your phone up to date. Again, I talked earlier about, you know, the upgrades and the things that are coming all the time in patches. That's critical, because usually when you're getting a fast patch from, whether it's Microsoft or getting it from Apple particularly, it's because they found a security issue. So you always want to be keeping up. And this is, again, what we talked about, being careful with the Bluetooth here. And always connect carefully. What are you connecting your phone to other things? If you're sharing it with, you know, sometimes you can share it with other phones. You can connect it to a laptop. You can connect it to a kiosk. All these things are important to think about, you know, when are you going to connect it, even going back to the idea of the free Wi-Fi. So just be, you know, continue to be mindful, keep those safe, and go through that. So these aren't exactly crazy kind of things, but it's just always think a little bit when you're doing something, is this a good action or not? Okay. And finally, get them to ask for help with their phones, right? If they don't know how to turn something off or turn something on, or they have a question, definitely ask for help, look for something, find a technically, if it's not you, then find a technically savvy, you know, relative. I know every family has one of those somewhere who really gets and geeks out, you know, in terms they do. Find somebody and ask for the help. They can help you set up phones, show you different things. Let's talk a little bit now, though, about, you know, gaming online. You know, this one, you know, is kind of important. Is the first one I talk about is implementing some of the restrictions There are ways to put age restrictions on things, allowing them to play certain games or not play certain things. Or, one of the other things is, can you play with people in other areas? And you do that sort of join the gamer type of thing. If you can only do, restrict it towards only friends only that you have to approve versus just anybody on the internet that you're playing a game with, it's important. Set passwords to prevent purchases, right? So you don't want to see people sort of buying different games and driving. And I'm a big fan of this idea, because when they do download something, you don't know where it might connect. So, just try to be good about that. Set some clear expectations and rules on how much time you can spend in gaming. We find, you can get lost in that, but also if someone connects with you, right, somebody says, hey, I want to play with this, or I want to connect up. I've actually seen this on some of the Sony stuff, and the connections you get are just they're almost like trolling. So you also want to be careful about that, and then teach them to be careful what they communicate back out. The games now are very interactive. You can have a lot of IM chats and those things that are going back and forth. It's just, to me, gaming safety online is no different than being on a platform. It's just it's the same thing as being on Facebook. It's the same thing as being on Twitter. Also, check apps before they're downloaded. Again, you want to make sure that wherever they're downloading stuff onto the gaming that they're doing, and this one particularly, I prefer going to more trusted sites to download games, not ones that you are. So, when you go into iTunes, or you go into sort of the Google store, those are ones I'm more appreciative. If you go onto other sites that know to download, you don't really know what's going on with some of those games. They may seem cheaper, or they may seem whatever, but I always err on the side of caution, because you don't know where they're coming from. Don't allow personal names being used here, right? So try to stay away from them identifying. Gamer tags are really important, sort of, a combination, maybe an initial and an A, like a street or something, but just make it something that where people can't connect sort of dots and using your name. Limit this idea of live chat conversations. And I'm really going to make my emphasis on this. This is where grooming happens sometimes. This is where you see the trolling stuff sort of happen. So, try to make sure that when you look at this online gaming, how do you limit that, in particular within game, playing with other folks? This is where we see a lot of those interactions happen. This one area too, I'm going to be a little bit more emphatic about these things, is really don't answer private messages from strangers. So you'll see this coming out on some of the gaming platforms where you can get these messages. You want to talk to your children about that. You also want to make sure that they themselves, come talk to you if they see it. So, a lot of times too, you're not going to get things that are really on the up and up in sort of the gaming area. Watch out for links and pop-ups. That I think is really important, because what they want you to do is to click on something. It's another form of clickbait. So when you see something pop up like that, you want to be careful. And finally, too, here, we talked about these chats, these private messages. It's another way of bullying as well. These platforms allow that to happen in some level. So I want to make sure you're always thinking about that. So part of the recommendation I always make is make sure you set those clear expectations and ground rules first. Talk about things where trigger events that they should come talk to you about it and feel comfortable. And if you really go through a couple of these things, it does help with the idea around, again, the gaming safety online. That's kind of important. Okay. So hopefully no worries, Joel. Thank you so much. Again, continue to ask questions after this. I do have some other safety tips and sort of pamphlets that I'll give over to Gwen and stuff, so she can put it in there. Just quick one-pagers, do's or don'ts, and actions I find always important. One of the last areas too we're going to get into is around how to look at these fake apps. This is one of my favorite thing around here is check the name of the app. Sometimes, they just don't make sense. Is there a developer name? Look for reviews. You know, apps that aren't really legit aren't there. If the dates are outdated somewhere, you know, when were they there? So if it's an app that has a weird date, we talked earlier about that idea in the fake news there. Beware of these discounts. Low price for something doesn't mean it's good. Okay, it means it's low price, right? Look at sometimes the screenshots of the apps themselves. You can tell where they are. Read the descriptions. The other thing is too, look at the number of downloads. When you see some, you know, fake apps out there, they don't get a lot of downloads and the things you're doing. But also, look at the permissions for what you can do. Or does it become overly permissive? Read about those. So I'm a big fan. I usually go in when I'm going to download something and I'll look at it in the App Store and I'll read through, have there been complaints about the app? How, do we know what they get permission to access? How have they done those different things? So I think that's this taking an extra minute and doing some research is really important about that, and the things that we're doing. Is there a threshold for the number of downloads, or is it 100? I think that's a great question. I think, what I will typically look at when you see, an app that's really being used a lot, it's typically in the high hundreds and thousands that are in there. If you see an app that's only been downloaded like 50 times, it's either a really bad app or it's not a good app, right? That's really a clear indication when you see those types of numbers. It's usually fishing to get out there and do something. So I think that's a great question. So yeah, I usually look in sort of high hundreds or in the thousands of downloads that you're really doing, because that really tells you that people are doing something with it. Would be my key indication there. What happens if you do download it? Every once in a while, life happens. Delete the app. I think is really important. Get that off as soon as you can. Visit the App Store, meaning that you want to go back and make sure that you'll see where this app was. If you've got to go back, look at what that means for you. Reset your phone. I think that's kind of important. My reason for doing this is it will potentially back up your data, but reset the phone because it takes a lot of the code that's out of there after you deleted it. And I think that's really important from this. So, and kind of going through that. And then what's particularly important, do back up your phone before you then reset it so you can come back and back it up with a delete. A couple of things I'm just going to hit here in this line are just giving you ideas to become more cyber savvy, I think, with what's going on in attacks. You'll see this in the news all the time. And whether you're on any type of website or you've been anywhere, even in the Ukrainian conflict right now, one of the key things that we're all really kind of watching is cyber attacks first. When we've seen these conflicts in the past, there was a piece of malware, a virus that came out of it that got out of control and actually imploded a number of computers around the world. It was something called NotPetya, and actually it was going after Ukrainian banks. So, one of the things that we always look at, this is a very real situation. So we want you to watch out for spam. We want you to watch out for phishing. That means they always want you to click on. We'll talk about some viruses and worms. Spyware and adware are always tough because they're downloading on the back and sending information. Ransomware is one thing we'll talk about, and DDoS is one. We talk about it, but it isn't always as big in sort of our commercial market. So a couple of things you want to do here is how do you detect an attack? And I think this is probably more important for me to talk to you about. You'll see some, unusual or mysterious emails, right? You're kind of like, why am I getting this topic of an email about something? That is one key indicator that there's an attack going on, and why are we sending it? You'll see messages about your password being changed. Okay, you have to go in and do something about it, go in, sort of change your password. And I think that's be important. Or they'll send you a message about a lockout of your account. What they want you to do is they want you to click on it. They want you to enter your password and enter your username. So these are really things that they get you techniques to do that. And the message above is also about, change your password and go in and do that. The other thing you'll see is some suspicious or unusual pop-ups. And this is interesting when you see this happen. Sometimes you may be on a website and you're working on a computer and it says, hey, you know, we can help make your computer go faster or do something, and just click this and it'll run a diagnostic on it. And so that's one that's usually, I would say, not only don't click it, but make sure you delete it, right? That's not one you want to go to. And the other one that we start to see, and it happens from time to time, you start to see slower than normal connections. It's taking you a longer time to connect, and it's sort of repeated, and it goes on and sort of driving through that. That's a kind of an indication that you got some problems there, okay? Something that may be eating up time. How do you recover from an attack? This one's really important. I think change your passwords. Try to change them on a periodic basis. You know, one of the things I think is really good too, in Apple right now, if you've ever noticed, you go in your settings, they'll actually identify where your passwords or your accounts may have been involved in a data breach. And they'll let you know that, and they'll say, hey, you know, you may want to change this password, right? Do definitely notify your contacts that something's happened, because most likely what will happen is the attacker will go take all those, take your stuff and use you to go contact them. So make it looks like it's coming from you. Okay, so do let your contacts know. I often talk about backing up of your files. So try to keep a backup somewhere. This is important, particularly if you end up clicking on some ransomware. And what ransomware really does is it comes down and it encrypts your whole hard drive. And then basically says, you know, you need to pay me so much in Bitcoin, and I'll give you your key and open up your files. One of the key ways to be able to address that is if you have a backup somewhere, you just basically, you rebuild the computer again, upload the data, and you go forward. So that's one that I do advocate, trying to find ways to back up your files in a different place and do it regularly. Try to determine what's been lost or compromised sometimes. You know, if you did go in an attack and they took some files and things, it may be, you know, if it's like your trust, a will, tax records, things that you may have kept on there. You know, try to understand what that is so you can make sure you deal with, you know, identity theft and that type of thing. Follow up on your antivirus recovery steps. I think a lot of times too, the virus will tell you some things when you're going in, how to clean up from that. You know, this is a lot of times we're talking about from kids, but like I say, it's adults. Check with a trusted adult. So if they think, if your children think something's happening, have them connect with you. One of the things that I always do too, just even from attacks or things that are happening out there, I am a big person having identity theft monitoring. I actually advocate that. It does cost a little bit. Equifax does have that. And I do like it because I actually put my bank account numbers on there. I put my credit card numbers on there. I put even sort of passport numbers on there. I put my social security numbers on there. And what they do is they constantly search the dark web for those things. And if it happens that, you know, I get a lot of announcements where my email address was compromised or was being sold in the dark web. It just lets you know, or somebody opened up a bank account in your name, right? Those are things that I look as an early warning system for me. So like I said, Equifax can kind of do that, and they'll just basically, you know, watch out for your stuff out there. And it's a good ounce of prevention in doing that. And you can do it for your whole family. You get that. You can do it for your children and your spouse and all that. I think that's really important. That's one of my, if I do anything around that, that's one of my key takeaways is be proactive about that. And actually, you really can get involved in this. Things we've talked about already. Strong passwords, right? Not 1, 2, 3, 4, not your favorite football team. A combination of uppercase, lowercase, special case, you know, characters and things that you do. It's really important. And why is that? Because they usually use password crackers. And what password crackers do is they just run through algorithms of trying to do combinations of all that. So the more you make the combinations of permutations, the longer it takes for them to crack it. So that's really what it is. To be able to crack, even if you do say 123 ABC 456 789 10, something like that. That type of one can be cracked easily, just because it's the permutations of that in the numbers and letters are very easily. Once you start putting special characters in, the permutations increase exponentially, and it becomes harder. Again, continue to watch these unfamiliar apps and unusual messages and the pop-ups. We talked a little bit earlier about, unsecured, using secured networks and Wi-Fi, in your home routers as well. I mean, one of the big issues we have with everyone working from home now and using that, do your best to go back and either work with your telecommunications provider, work with a savvy, relative, or even if your child actually knows how to do that, make sure you configure your routers and switches in home and that they're done securely. You hide what you don't broadcast your wireless SID so that people come into it, put protection on that. Make sure your software is up to date, and please always enable your security features and keep your antivirus up to date. These are all things that will really help you along the board and many things you're doing. So I think the last thing that we want to talk about today is about, again, building cyber trust. One of the best things that you can do for your children in this is have an open communication around and a trusted relationship. Everything that we've been talking about today, whether it's been the cyberbullying, whether it's been the downloading, whether it's been the trolling, in the grooming, or all those types of things are, have an adult to be able to go back to and have a conversation with. It's just so important. So what we really try to advocate with all of you is this. One, I think what's good here is also practice what you preach by setting a good example, right? So teaching good passwords, practice what you preach in terms of what you post and the things, you've got to be that role model for them to emulate, which I think are really important. Ask questions, encourage your kids to be open and talk about what they're doing online. It's the same thing you do when you ask them, how did it go at school today? Right? You want to know, ask them what's going online, what people are doing, what the kids are into today, but also educate them, your kids on the skills they need to be safe. Again, not going to certain sites, don't download free Wi-Fi, all of those things. Just, it doesn't have to be overbearing, but just continue to work with them and do that. And what we want to talk about here are some helpful tips. These are our 7 ones that I think are always important. One, set some clear ground rules. Talk about how much screen time. You can limit that screen time, negotiate what those things are and why. Also talk about downloading something. But probably one of the most important things, if you think something happened, come. It's a funny thing, even in the rules I work in my firm, if I've got people tuned enough now, if they feel like they clicked on something, they call me, right? So I'm so appreciative, just because I say, great, that was an easy one, don't worry about it, but I'm happy you were thinking about it. So it's just that is helping it. I think to just try to monitor activity. You'll see kids posting certain things, or you'll see them, we talked earlier about what are the signs of cyberbullying, what that means. Just stay prevalent. Remind them, don't give out personal information, okay? They're not asking for it, people don't do it, just try to keep private. Make sure you upload any virus tools. That's just it's such a key thing around right now. It doesn't solve every problem, but boy, it does a lot. In that, and whether it's Symantec, McAfee, they're so prevalent right now that you can get them. Be careful again with stranger. This always reminds me of a video that we got early on that was about stranger danger, and they would talk about how you communicate with things, and that was where someone would, a stranger comes up to you in a public place. Same thing apply here. People are strangers on the internet, what they're talking to you about. Pause before you post. Think twice, post once, okay? I can't be more emphatic about this one. This one will save you so many times. I'm actually one of those people, I have a 2-minute delay on all my emails that go out. I'll say that again, I have a 2-minute delay on every email. Why? Because I call it the Brian stupid factor. Because there's always something where, did I really mean to say what I said? Okay, and it has saved me probably 100 times in my career where I stopped and I caught the email before it went out. And I said, that's not what I wanted to say. So, it's tricks like that. So it goes for us. So pause before you post. But also be a friend, don't be a bully. It's a lot of things can go wrong in group thinking, and you can get sucked up into this idea. Just be a friend with where you are, be an upstander. We talk about that, all these kinds of things. So we kind of keep it at 7, but I think these are really good things. The number one for me is probably the most important. Just have expectations, have guardrails. And sometimes you're not going to be popular in what you do, and that's okay. There's ages, the maturity. You've got to be able to look at your own child. I can't give you a prescriptive idea of when to say it's right or not. 7, 9, 10, 12. Again, it always goes down to the maturity of the child. It goes down to the ability to have a trust relationship. All those things are important when you really can engage on these types of things. And so with that being said, this is done with a lot of the formal presentation. I'll say this much. I know that was a lot. I'm glad that we always sort of do a video. You can always go back and look at that. We'll post some one pagers as well. Great topics like that. And what I will say at the end before we wrap up any questions is, one, I want to thank you for all showing up and being part of it today. This world is in the cyber world. There's so many things that can go wrong quickly. And by you taking a few minutes today, educating yourself, you're helping your kids, you're helping yourself, you're helping me as a cybersecurity professional, so that we just get people to think twice, cut once, measure twice, cut once, do all these things. Just pause before you hit it and do that. So I want to thank everyone for being around that today. And then I'll just open it up for any final questions.
Brian, anyone who has questions, feel free to also put it in the chat. And if you have questions after the session, feel free to email me, or you could even email the town office, because they know to direct questions to me, and I will share them with Brian after the fact. But also kind of help us gauge your certain topics that are of interest to you to inform future sessions like this. Again, a huge thank you to Brian for being so gracious and giving with your time and your expertise. I definitely jotted down some notes that I will be discussing with my teenage boys after this. So this has been very helpful. Very much appreciate your time, Brian, and just look forward to the senior session tomorrow, because there are definitely some things that I think are relevant, especially with the identity theft stuff.
They are, and yeah, and I'm a big advocate on that too. Is that helping train a generation who is really trying to take advantage of the internet. I think is really important. So again, we'll talk about a lot of those topics tomorrow. If you have parents that are really driving, please join in with us.
Yeah, very much.
Talk about catfishing.
Yeah, find out what that actually means. All right. Well, I think that's it. And again, thank you everyone for joining us.